I will tell you, it makes me sad to break up such high energy community this morning. I'm excited to see that everybody's already at the right level of vibe of energy for today. Welcome to the 2024 Conference on Texas, Ode to Juneteenth, Slavery in Texas. I am Dirk Elmendorf. I'm the CEO and president of the Whitty Museum. The Conference on Texas brings together scholars, this time from around the country, to share their latest research and foster meaningful conversation about our state's history. The topic of slavery resonates nationally. It reflects broader conversations on race and history, and it is critical to understanding the past of Texas. These are difficult conversations to have, but that difficulty is in no way removed by staying in ignorance. Our focus is on surfacing facts so that we can discuss the realities of our past and understand how they shape our present and impact our future. The Whitty has a very Texas view of history, in that if it happened in Texas, it's important to us. And that can be millions of years with dinosaurs that were only found here, thousands of years ago with the people of the Pecos, hundreds of years ago for the history that we're going to talk about today, and to the present. For us, Texas deep time means if it happened here, it's important. And by using that lens, we are allowed to escape just celebrating military victories or government accomplishments. We get to tell untold stories, provide context for the work and accomplishments of all kinds of people in all kinds of times if it happened here. And that's what we're here to talk about today. This conference this year is co-presented in partnership with SACAM, the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. I was going to say, could you please stand and be recognized as partners if you're with SACAM? SACAM, would you stand for a moment? And the Smithsonian, our Shared Future, Reckoning with Our Racial Past initiative. We get to be kind of the kickoff event. There was just an event, we're the first big conference as part of 2 weeks of events related to that topic. I want to thank the donors who stepped forward to help make this possible. A special thanks to HEB, our presenting sponsor, and their longtime support of the Whitty Museum. And we are proud to partner again with Winnell Herron, who you will meet tomorrow, who is a champion of the Whitty's work to tell the untold stories and a member of our steering committee for both Black Cowboys and this Conference on Texas. I'd also like to thank the Bank of America for your continued support and to welcome Doctors Walter and Shirley Massey, who venture here from Chicago, who are also members of the steering committee. I would especially like to acknowledge the Smithsonian's Reckoning with Our Racial Past initiative and Dr. Deborah Mack, who is here today, as a leader in this. Did you want to stand? Thank you. We appreciate the support of the William Knox Holt Foundation, the Wells Fargo Advisors, Humanities Texas, Spurs Sports and Entertainment, the Smothers Foundation, Frost Bank, Jefferson Bank, the San Antonio Area Foundation, and the George and Jill Vassar. These donors stepped forward and supported us from the very beginning and made it possible for us to take such a big swing in anchoring in an important topic and centering it, not making it off to the side, and gave us the resources we need to hopefully host the event that you will all enjoy today. The Ode to Juneteenth, Slavery in Texas is really focused on the foundational role of chattel slavery in the formation and growth of Texas. The conference will center on the lives of enslaved people. I think that all too often in these discussions, it's the enslaved part, not the people part of the story, that is focused on and celebrated, and I think today we're actually going to be able to dive into a lot of that and bring it into better context. Every facet of expanding the Texas economy was impacted by slavery and enslaved labor. Enslaved people not only labored on cotton and sugar plantations, but they also worked as artisans, as blacksmiths, seamstresses, and even enslaved cowboys. The economy of Texas was so dependent on slavery that it wasn't until June 19, 1865, now celebrated in Texas and as a federal holiday on Juneteenth, where enslaved people freed from bondage in Texas 2 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. I think there's an important point to be made about this conference. The Whitty has hosted 8 of these conferences, and our mission has always been to help transform the scholarship into something that we can contextualize for our visitors and our community, and that is really a big part of our mission. This conference is different because at the end you will see we have a call to action that is about action. This isn't just history for its own sake. It's allowing history to penetrate us and allow us to understand the context so that we can move forward and move better. The Whitty is proud to be a platform for this discussion and the great community that we have collected here, without whom this wouldn't be possible. This isn't the scope or scale of thing the Whitty could ever do by itself, and I'm proud that we found donors and scholars and supporters of all kinds to come engage in this good work. The goals of this conference were shaped by an outstanding steering committee, many of whom you will hear speaking in the next few days. If you're a member of the steering committee, I'd ask you to please stand for a moment and be recognized for your great work. That steering committee was led by the irreplaceable and the irascible Aaronetta Pierce. I'm proud to say a longtime Whitty Museum trustee, advocate, community leader, and now your speaker.
Good morning, good afternoon, good morning. This day has been a long time coming. We've been planning for you for a very long time, and we're so glad that this has come. I'd like to say that I stand before you because of a lot of people who helped me to stand here today. I'd like to begin by thanking first of all, Dirk, who just spoke to you as the director of the museum, for walking in, finding that this conference was on the table, and for taking the ball and running with it. I thank you very much, Dirk. The reason that this conference was already on the table is that the inimitable Maurice McDermott was director of the museum, and she is now director emeritus, and deservedly so. When we talked about this conference, just as when we talked about Black Cowboys, she said, let's do it, let's do it. And when that happens, you have permission, and that permission has allowed us to be in the revered, almost 100-year-old Whitty institution as a museum, and we are honored and proud to be in this space. I would like to thank the staff of the museum, and headed particularly by Michelle Everidge, whom you'll see running back and forth, but this time I'd like to ask her to stand and be recognized. Thank you for so much of the work that is seen today and yet unseen in its planning. I'd like to recognize the curator of American history, who also was brought on board by Maurice McDermott, and I'd like to ask Ron Davis to please stand. And for all she's done, I keep talking about her, but I'd like to ask Maurice to please stand. I hope she's properly embarrassed. You've already seen the committee represented, and it is a powerful group of people because it's one thing to have an idea, but I am grateful to all of the speakers who are a part of this program today, because they took the time and the work and the research and the dedication to the story to earn the scholarship that they will present to you today, and for them we are all grateful. Thank you to the speakers who are going to be present. One of the important parts of any conference is kind of getting one anchor presenter that you have a lot of respect for to sign on to help you with the scholarship. Because there's one thing to do the planning and work that goes into organizing things to come today, but it's another thing to have that dynamic scholar, professor, who can center everything and put it together for you. And I am talking about Dr. Daina Ramey Berry. Dr. Berry is an American historian, an academic who is the Michael Douglas Dean of Humanities and Fine Art at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She was formerly the Associate Dean of the Graduate School and the first African American to serve as chairperson of the History Department at the University of Texas at Austin. She studies gender and slavery, as well as Black women's history in the United States. She has earned 3 levels of degrees from the University of California. She has earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in history, and in 1992, just 2 years later, in 1994, she earned a Master of Arts degree in African American Studies, and then 4 years later, took her 4 years, and in 1988, she received a PhD in United States history from UCLA. In 2016, Dr. Berry served as a historical consultant and technical advisor for the remake of Roots by Alex Haley, where she worked with the writers on the script and advised on-set supporting the directors and actors during filming. She is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She recently completed a Black woman's history of the United States with Professor Kali Nicole Gross of Rutgers University. Dr. Berry is the award-winning author and editor of 6 books and several scholarly articles. One of her recent books, entitled The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to Grave in the Building of a Nation. It received 3 book awards, including the Phyllis Wheatley Award for Scholarly Research from the Sons and Daughters of the U.S. Middle Passage. It was also a finalist for the 2018 Frederick Douglass Book Prize Award by Yale University. Dr. Berry is a scholar of the enslaved and the perfect consultant and friend to kick off the conference as a keynote on slavery in Texas. Join me in welcoming my link sister, Dr. Daina Berry.
Here's your clicker, hold on.
Thank you.
Good morning. There's no way to enter this stage gracefully when you have a crutch, so pardon me. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm waiting for my paper. Somebody picked it up. And also, do you
Make sure they're,
yeah, and then for dancing.
this big green button.
That's it?
That's it.
Yep, that's everything.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a wonderful space. It's wonderful to be back in Texas. My family was here for 13 years. We left 2 years ago to my new position at Santa Barbara, but it's always feels like home to be here at the Whitty with the staff and all of my fellow Texans that I haven't seen in a while. So I want to say thank you. I also was honored when the esteemed Aranella Pierce invited me and my former student, Ron Davis, to present and kick off this conference. This is the type of gathering that I've wanted to host, I've wanted to be a part of for a long time. Actually, I have planned several conferences on Texas slavery. They just never came to fruition until today, so it's a pleasure to be here. I also want to begin with gratitude to the Whitty Museum for being a forerunner in this history, to be bold about teaching this history, and to be a front runner in talking about the stories of the enslaved. I want to thank the staff. I also want to thank SACAM for all of the work that they've done in the community, and the sponsors that were already mentioned. So to begin, I want to just talk briefly and give us an overview, a very, very brief overview of the history of slavery in Texas. This is a very complex and large history. It's as complex and large as the geography and topography of this state. About 10 years ago, I wrote an article in the Santa Barbara, see, where do I live? In the San Antonio News Express, and shared that Texas slave history stands out because it involves Spain, Mexico, and the United States. And depending on who was in charge, there was always a mix of pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists in Texas, leading to a contentious and confusing struggle for land acquisition, labor practices, and race relations. Now, I divided this history, and you'll see this now, we see this in textbooks as well, but I divided this history into 5 time periods. The contact period, this is very, very like 5 minutes of Texas history. Many of you in this room already know this, right? The contact period from 1528 to 1690, which is when indigenous people who had already been present here interacted with both African and European explorers. The Spanish colonial period from 1690 to 1821, where slavery was legal in parts of New Spain and Central America, which included Panama, Mexico, the Philippines, as well as parts of the Caribbean. Then we have the Mexican national period from 1821 to 1836. And in this period, I think it's important because this is when enslaved people were brought to Texas from deep South states like Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and so forth. And they were brought here and were granted 80 acres of land for every enslaved person who came. I think a lot of people, we need to pause on that for a minute. You received 80 acres of land for every enslaved person that you brought into this region. It's a lot of land, and it becomes a lot of money later. Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829, but that did not stop enslavers from bringing their personal property into the state. It wasn't a state at the time, but to bring them into this region. And they established their homesteads, and they used enslaved people for labor. The next period, the Republic, from 1836 to 1845, this is when Texas won its independence from Mexico, and deep South migration continued. One of the things that I like to emphasize in this is to think about that this was not a place where slavery was new. It was a place where people transported their experiences with slavery, their plantation communities that they had established, their homesteads. They transported it and brought it to Texas. So this is not something that was an experiment, because they had already been practicing slavery in other states, and they just moved to a space where they had more land and they could cultivate different types of crop. So during the Republic period, we also saw the removal of Native Americans and the cultural clashes that involved enslaved people who were sometimes enslaved by, married to, had run away with indigenous people. And Professor Nakia Parker, one of my former students, will talk about this a little bit later on today. Now, the demography of slavery and looking at how slavery grew over time in the state is something that you saw on the conference website, this sort of overview of the changes. And as I explained earlier, Texas had about 5,000 slaves during the time of its revolution in 1836. But by 1845, when the state was annexed to the United States, the enslaved population had increased to 30,000. In the 5th period of early Texas history, when the Lone Star State reached statehood, the period from 1845 to 1865, Texas was admitted to the Union on December 29th of 1845 as a slave state. So antebellum Texas was 1845 to 1865. And by the eve of the Civil War, the enslaved population was 30% of the state's population at 182,566 souls. Now, what have historians said about Texas history? In particular, how has the history of slavery in Texas been addressed in academic scholarship? I want to talk briefly. There's so much literature, and I'm not going to do justice to any of it because they only could fit a few on the slide. But I wanted to just sort of give you an overview of how the literature has changed over time. And I'm going to say that these are just some books on the history of slavery in Texas. And obviously, I can't begin this history without talking about Arwen Barr and Dr. Mike Campbell, some of the pioneer writers of this history who looked at African American experiences in Texas. However, the early literature did not fully address the humanity of the enslaved. Instead, enslaved people were objects of study, sometimes presented as a monolithic group with very little individuality. Other scholars like Andrew Torgett, in particular, offered a bit more perspective on the history of slavery, but I would argue that enslaved people were not fully central in these works, and now we are in a period of reflection that emphasizes the importance of scholarship with deeper dives into the humanity of the enslaved through multiple perspectives. There has also been a breadth of biographies on various individuals, reference works on groups of people, and excellent online resources, which I'll briefly discuss in a few minutes. I would argue that in any field, a student, it's important for them to go to the archives, and most of my students know this. We spend lots of time in the archives trying to uncover documents, stories, individuals that we may have never heard about. Looking at letters, we can look at a letter from a planter or an enslaver to his wife, or from a daughter to a son that are enslaved, that own enslaved people. And in those letters are stories and stories of enslaved people buried in the letters. And when you look at the descriptive inventories of these archives, you don't see the names of the enslaved people. You don't see who is in that letter. And we're now at a point where we're trying to make these changes, where scholars and archivists and librarians and docents at museums are trying to tell the stories that are buried within these letters and buried within these papers. And that's where we'll uncover more and more data and more information about the enslaved. And it's there. I'm telling you, it's there. We've seen it. We uncover it, and we have all these aha moments in the archives. It's quite exciting. It's a moment of discovery that very few people probably have experienced, and if you ever do, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's also important to discuss the material culture, and we will look at that over the next couple days. We'll look at art and also products that enslaved people produced. You'll learn about craftspeople, potters, builders, and others. One of the things that changed how we understand slavery, from my perspective, is this long depth into looking at the lives of the enslaved. And I would really argue that John Blassingame was one of the first scholars to really look at things from the enslaved perspective. Thank you. John Blassingame is my academic grandfather. He was my advisor's advisor. He was a professor at Yale University. And I learned through him, through my advisor. And we'll talk about genealogies in a few. But for so long, the history had been taught from the perspective of those that did the enslaving, right? And the conversations and comments and experiences of enslaved were often buried in the literature. But for decades now, scholars and archivists and archaeologists and historians have started to look at the literature from the enslaved perspective, finding ways to teach this history from a way that had not been taught in the past. I would say that although this has been happening for 30 years, it's a new methodological intervention. I would still call it new until it's incorporated in all of our works. I think it transformed the scholarship. So Blassingame published The Slave Testimony, an excellent study of voices of enslaved people and their experiences. We also have a number of other edited volumes that were produced in the 1970s, the WPA papers, the Workers' Progress Administration, which I'll be happy to talk about in a few minutes as well, and happy to answer questions about that. But in the slave community, Blassingame really centered enslaved people's lives. He had stories literally about courtship, how a person would approach another person and the kind of riddles they would play with one another, about how they danced together in the evenings and how they shared food, how they competed during corn shucking competitions. Very powerful and vivid and textual experiences where we could feel like we were literally in the community with enslaved people. We wanted to think about what does it feel like to be at the dinner table with them in the evening? What does it feel like to be in their cabin at night? They're exhausted. They've had a long day. They're struggling. They're surviving an institution that is doing everything to dehumanize them. What are they saying to one another? We don't have those answers, but we can try to get to them by digging deeper and deeper into the past. The story of slavery told by the slave is a method of doing history. And as I mentioned, Blassingame and Brenda Stevenson, my advisor, there's also, we're going to hear from this week, Ed Baptist, who did The Half Has Never Been Told, very powerful study that took on all kinds of questions about slavery and economy and social capitalism. And we also are not going to hear from, but I would encourage everyone to read the work of Stephanie Jones Rogers. Her work is a very, very interesting methodological approach to write about the history of women that enslaved people. The plantation mistress is the term that we used to use, from the perspective of enslaved people. She used the documents from enslaved people to tell the story about how they were enslaved by white women. A very, very powerful way of looking at the methodology and listening to the voices of the enslaved. And that is that she received the first she was the first black woman to receive the Los Angeles Times National Book Award for that work. And then I just put my book down there, not for self-aggrandizement, but because I wrote the book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, to think about, my question was, when I started, was like, what are the enslaved people thinking? How do they feel? What did it mean for them to stand on the auction block and look at the audience? How do we write that history from the perspective up here, looking out, as opposed to looking at them, gazing at them, monetizing them? How does that experience look, and what can we learn about them, and what do they say about being treated as a commodity? What did they say about being treated as an object but that was very unique, because that object could emote, that object could talk back, that object could disrupt their sale, that object could say, I'm not worth that much, I have an injury over here, or I don't know how to do that, I don't give birth to children. This is a very different object than any other object that was on the market. So when we write about enslaved people, we write about them as whole human beings. We write about them as people. Although they were legally property, we write about them as people. They were chattel, human chattel, a movable form of property. They were objectified and treated as property, but they fought back, they showed us their humanity, and it's a blessing that we have the opportunity to listen. So we're going to have a lot of new discoveries. There's been a lot of new discoveries because of the digital world that we are in, through documents housed, as I mentioned, in family basements and attics, deep in the archives that have never been touched, are now being uncovered, are now being digitized, preserved in the archives, and allowing us to tell much different stories. I listed on the left-hand side a number of projects. There's plenty more, but a number of projects that are online now that you can learn about the history of slavery, not just in Texas, but also larger projects like the Slavery Voyages Project, which has been going on for almost 50 years now. There's a number of studies at universities now. Through the University of Virginia started the studies of slavery in the university. Rice University is doing work in that area. Prairie View A&M has been doing and been a leader in this work as well. The University of Texas is doing a contextualization of their history as well. And I have to say, years ago I presented a paper on UT Austin, and while I was still there at a conference, I think it was at Yale, and Texas at the time likes to brag, the university likes to brag about, not having roots to slavery because they were founded in the 1880s. Now, come on, right? Not having roots, but the majority of the first 8 faculty members were from large slaveholding families. The board of trustees of the university were from large slaveholding families. So the funding of the university, the foundation of the institution came from slavery, although the institution had been abolished. I think it's important to recognize that. And I know that work is being done, and they're uncovering way more stories than I knew a few years ago about that. And universities are now reckoning with this history, which is a wonderful thing, because the more we learn about our past, the more we can understand how to move forward in the future. But we are more interactive now, as I say here. We have a greater sensory experience of the history of slavery. I've always taught by trying to teach the history of slavery through our senses. How do we see slavery? How do we hear slavery? How do we touch? How do we smell? How do we taste? It might sound like, how can you do that? Well, we made food in class. We got cookbooks, you know. I brought in liquid smoke, because if you've ever been to the South and you know what it smells like when the crops are burning, there's this different scent that's in the air, right? I tried to bring in smells that made it sound, that give you like that feeling of being somewhere. I brought in cotton, raw cotton, and we could feel that, we could touch it. We looked at images of enslaved people, and anytime I show pictures, I always tell my students, look in their eyes. Look at the individuals. What are they wearing? What expressions are they showing on their faces? What can we learn from gazing at them? And we now have the capability, because of technology, to zoom into photographs that we couldn't do years ago. Photographs that we've seen from afar away that now, because of different forms of technology like TIFF files, we can zoom right in and see what earrings a person's wearing. Find out whether or not, in pictures that we had seen, women were breastfeeding. We never even saw that. Or dogs that were sitting there next to them as their pets. We never saw those pets. There were aspects of the slave community that we just couldn't see, but technology has changed the way we see slavery, and I'm very happy that we are able to do it in this way. We are now generating maps. We're putting movement into this history. We're mapping where people went. There's websites that we know from Ed Baptiste, we'll probably talk about it a little bit later, but where they're doing crowdsourcing and looking at enslaved people's movement. Freedom seekers, we're going to learn about that as well. So these are really interesting ways of digging deeper into this history in ways that we could not do 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We also are, as we stand here today at this site, we are at the space where we're looking at doing history in different locations. And the public, this space here, the public museum space, and doing public history is a very, very important site for us to have these conversations. The importance of museums is central to understanding and teaching history. We know that the practitioners of history are important, such as scholars working with docents and making sure that the stories of the past are accurate, factual, and true. It's our ability and we are charged with making sure we are authentic about our practice of history and professionalism, removing political language and jargon and objectives and just giving us the factual history, right? And this is the job of the historian. This is the job of the public scholar, and this is the purpose of this gathering. Work is being done to change the narratives in textbooks, not change because, actually I should say, to fill out those stories. What I didn't share in my bio is that I've spent the last few years working on with textbooks. I've done 4 textbooks now: middle school, 2 middle school, high school, and now a college-level textbook on U.S. history. Thank you. And I'm really wanting to make sure African American people are placed in this history, but that's not the only reason why I'm doing this, but I'm making sure that we're telling stories about women that were ignored. Like, who are all the people that were at a particular moment? How can we make sure everybody that was at that moment is represented? And how can we tell their stories so that the students that pick up these books find themselves in those books and not find themselves being erased or ignored or marginalized? And that is the work that we are doing. This conference itself is an opportunity to tell the story and inform the public understanding of history and to talk about why history matters. You know, we have a number of projects here on the screen. A number of the scholars that you will hear from today are leading the efforts. I remember when they found the urban slave community in Austin, and now, you know, there's a museum site there. You know, you can now learn about and read the panels there. We're still arguing about the Alamo, and I'll let everybody here have that argument. I'm not jumping in that one right now. But we also have, you know, we're remodeling spaces to make sure they're authentic and to make sure that they're telling the right story. And this is the role of us as public scholars and as public intellectuals. One story I want to share, though, before I close and sort of launch this conference, is about what happens is the responsibility of museums and public spaces like the Whitty, and what are other ways that we can revise and update history to make it more accurate. And that's the story of what happened at the, I always say this, Worcester? I hope I'm saying that right. Worcester, Massachusetts. Did I say it right? Worcester, right? Worcester, thank you. Thank you. I always get it wrong, Worcester. They had, about 7 or 8 years ago, they started changing this one exhibit on the local members of the community. There was a portraiture exhibit of prominent figures in this community. And what they did was they added labels that tied them to the connection to slavery. And it was very controversial. I advise you to look it up if you can. But they tried to correct the history and add some depth. So this person, a lot of the descriptions before of the labels said, this was a prominent political figure, he or she's family was a major family here, they've served in these offices and so forth. But they never said that their wealth was built on slaveholding or slave trading. And so this was one of the things that they changed. The old label just described the person, might have talked about the material, like the clothing they wore, what it was made out of, might have talked about a brooch a woman had or the earrings she had, but they didn't talk about how they generated and how they received that wealth. So the new sign next to this picture, the one above, the brown label of Russell Sturgis reads, quote, in 1783, Russell Sturgis' brothers-in-law and his brothers-in-laws established a business in Santo Domingo, now Haiti, which traded in flour, horses, and slaves. That's just a small thing that a museum can do that can just make a difference, but also contextualize the wealth that was generated from the institution of slavery. And that brings us to today, Ode to Juneteenth, Slavery in Texas. Texas has made national history because of Juneteenth, which is now a federal holiday. And today and tomorrow, we will make history via this conference, which combines new cutting-edge scholarship, material culture, art, musical performances, and the history of the lives of the enslaved and free and unfree. We will learn about people like Fannie Brown, who I use the title for my talk. She came to Texas from Virginia. Stories of women like Fannie Brown, who was born in Virginia and later transported to Texas. Her experience differed from others that came from Georgia or North Carolina. Thus, when people arrived in Texas, they established new familial ties, fought for their freedom, and as Brown noted, they endured the Freedom War. You will learn about slavery, the Civil War, Juneteenth, and the Freedom War. Here, I always want people to think about what do enslaved people in Texas tell us about their stories. Ask these questions. How do they tell us their stories? If they were to write the history of slavery, what would it say? How would they begin those stories? Fortunately, we have their stories from a number of narratives, and we can now incorporate them into our history books. Again, I'm asking you, if anyone shows slides with individuals, take a moment to look at those people, try to see them as human beings, as whole human beings. Think about the families that are represented there, how they might be related to one another, whether they're kin or fictive kin. You will learn over the next 2 days about enslaved cowboys. You will see the exhibit here. You'll learn about freedom seekers, about slavery in various regions, in different time periods, about Native American enslavers, freedom in Texas, Juneteenth, unfree labor. You'll also learn about enslaved and skilled craftspeople, material culture, freedom and citizenship, freedom and capitalism, slavery's legacies, the aftermath of slavery, and the next steps are where do we go from here, which we'll close out with tomorrow. You're going to hear from university professors, museum professionals, artists, public historians, architects, urban planners, and foundation directors. Some of the leading experts on the Texas slavery will share their research over the next 2 days. In addition to Ed Baptiste, Annette Gordon-Reed will deliver tonight's keynote address. You will also hear from Frank de la Teja, who will share about the history of Spanish Texas. You will hear from Kelly Carter Jackson, who will empower us with her work on Black resistance, radical Black resistance. Michaela Al-Udain will reveal the history of self-liberated people, and there'll be others that talk about that as well. Tara Dudley will bring to life the untold stories of enslaved master builders. Andrea Roberts will speak on commemoration. Paula King Harper will share the history of the Wilson Potters, and many, many other speakers that you can see on the website and in your program. And finally, I have to end with the story of my students and John Blasingame's great-grandchildren, who are here on the panel. And I just, as a proud advisor, I had to say that you will hear from 3 of my former students who will carry the legacy of the history of the enslaved and the history of enslaved people. And I welcome you, and I'm thankful to be here, and I thank you so much. Do you want me to take questions? Do we have time? I don't know. Okay. Are there questions or comments? Yes. Good question. Will the talks be published? That's a question that I know you can answer.
Hi. We are hoping to publish the talks in an edited volume. Dr. Whitney Stewart is going to help us do that from our steering committee, and who you'll hear later today. These conference presidings are also being filmed, and so all of them will be available on YouTube after today's conference so that you can refer back to them. And we're going to unfortunately ask you to make some tough decisions between sessions, and so please keep in mind the ones you're missing. You'll be able to catch those on YouTube afterwards. Other questions? And I have the mic.
Dr. Massey.
Thank you for that wonderful overview of the conference. And I was so pleased to hear about you writing the textbooks. Yes. Question, given this changing political climate, should we be concerned about the textbooks being used in schools? And if so, what actions do you think we ought to be contemplating to at least not let that happen?
Great question, especially in the era of banning books, right? I always tell people, look at what books are being banned and read them, because there's a reason why they're being banned. They don't want you to hear certain aspects of those stories, and those are the books we should read. About textbooks, so there are 2 things I would say to answer your question, and I appreciate the question. One, the textbooks that were written in the early 40s and 50s were often written from a specific political perspective that were a lot of the general state histories, like the history of Georgia, the history of Texas, the history of Mississippi, were written by former Confederate generals. A lot of them were untrained scholars. They were not practicing historians or public scholars. And what we're seeing now is over the last, I would say, 30 years, the textbooks have been a little bit broad, and now we're trying to go in and, as I mentioned, tell stories. I just finished the narrative history of the United States with W.W. Norton, which comes out this year. This is the 13th edition, but they hired 3 new authors to then go in and look at women that were not included, Latinx people that were not included, indigenous people that were not included, and add those stories. I hope that they would not ban textbooks that have been highly regarded for decades because these stories are now included. And one of the things that we're saying, and that I would argue, is we have to tell the history based on that time period and based on the documents that were there. So how can you ban the actual truth of history, right? And I'm arguing that we need to continue to use them. I haven't seen textbooks banned yet, but maybe you guys know something different than I don't. I haven't seen any textbooks. So that's one of the reasons why I shifted to textbooks. While my own book was not allowed in state prisons here, I had a friend try to send it to a relative, and they sent it back. Textbooks are one way to do it. We've also been doing a lot of educating with K through 12 educators, where we're doing workshops, because one of the things I've seen in textbooks, the reason why stuff was missing was that people weren't taught this when they were learning history. So we can't be upset with our educators if they never learned it. We have to now educate our educators so that we can educate the public. Mm-hmm.
Hello, I'm Dr.
Hi.
Lisa Brown, University of Kearney Word, and I do a lot of work with William Darity and reparations. And I just wanted to praise you for this wonderful work that you're doing. I think most recently is an attempt by the Census Bureau and Office of Management and Budget to reevaluate race and ethnicity categories. And this is going to be so important to that, because one of my critiques was that most of their data collection is very quantitative, and we don't get into the stories. So when you don't have that data, you miss these kind of nuances of qualitative information that preserves our history. So thank you for your work. I would love to get your contact information information. And I just tweeted Dr. McDowell and told her that you
Deborah McDowell, yes.
you were here speaking, and so I've been sharing all your stuff on Twitter. And I'm just thank you to Whitty for doing this. I'm so glad I found out about it at the last minute and was able to participate, and look forward to continuing. Thank you.
Thank you. It's important. It is so important to do both quantitative and qualitative research. We need both, and I think that's what we're starting to see now. And it's important because it fills in those stories that numbers and other statistics don't tell us. Other questions? Someone way over here.
Dr. Rolanda Teal, I've done a lot of work on the Underground Railroad system in the U.S. What I really wanted to say about everything that you're talking about is that need that we have to use what I term all the time multivocal narration. And that if you look at history, there's really no time in American history where you had an isolated group. Mm-hmm. Cultures were always interacting. And so anytime I discuss, my background is anthropology, archaeology. Anytime I discuss a cultural group, I bring in everybody else that was a part of it. Mm-hmm. This has been controversial at times because they want me to stick to a particular narrative. Yes. But of course, as an educator, I want to tell the whole story. Right. And so I have to bring in every cultural group, and most often it's going to be Latina, Black, European, Indigenous. All four of those stories get told at the same time. And how does it corrupt the history if you're telling it? And it makes people able to see themselves. If I come into a museum like this, and I tour 3 floors, and I don't see anything that talks about me, I don't come back. Mm-hmm. So that's something we also have to pay attention to. If we don't have those multivocal narratives, you miss complete audiences. So thank you all, and thank the Whitney as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. I fully agree. Fully agree. Dr. Catherine Clinton, a major author.
Hi, Daina.
Of
but I
history.
have to say that this conference is such a wonderful event, having you come back as a speaker. And I just want to praise song your work on women, because I met you at a conference and with your mother there and speaking about your grandfather, and just the way you have made museums put women into the picture. And you've done that through conferences here, and you're doing that through your very hard work as an administrator and on textbooks. And I know the fight is long, the fight is hard. You've spoken about the kind of backlash that you can get, but just know that we do welcome you back to Texas, and we'll sneak your books into every place we can get them.
Thank you so much. Thank you. While she's passing the mic, I have to say that this is ongoing work. You know, this is work that we're doing every day. You might not see it. There's a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes, but we are working hard to make sure that we're teaching this history and telling it. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. And I think you probably just answered my question, which is, you mentioned doing history. Can you describe a little bit more what you mean by that versus how we traditionally think of history?
Oh, wow, yeah. So we're doing history today here by offering some of the top scholars, some of the top public intellectuals, and sharing this with a wide audience, an open conference here at the Whitty. It's accessibility. We're in the community. We're not just in our ivory towers at our universities talking to the 10 or 12 specialists in our field. We're going out. When I say doing history, we're doing workshops at high schools, at junior high schools. We're working on Zoom calls and phone calls to help people create lesson plans that adhere to the standards of the state, but also allow them to sort of dip in a few other stories, to tell other stories, to broaden that perspective. We're doing history by going to the archives and looking for more stories, by working with libraries to change the descriptive inventories to include the enslaved people that are listed in those letters that may or may not have names. We're writing about the named and unnamed people, because even the unnamed have stories that contribute to what we're telling. That is all just a few examples of doing history.
Dr. Berry, I want to take the liberty on behalf of SACAM, every community historian that is here, every interested person that is here, just to say thank you so much for your work. We appreciate you, and you deserve a standing ovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very kind. Very kind. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I got us back on schedule.
Yeah, you did.
See? All right, so I think we're going to come up and say a few things. I'm going to ungracefully walk off the stage, and I look forward to interacting with you all over the next day and a half. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Berry, for opening this conference and for grounding us in this historical scholarship. We have a few housekeeping notes for you. At 10:30, we will begin the hard decision-making of concurrent sessions. Those concurrent sessions are happening on the other side of the Whitty Museum, so you will exit this room. You'll go through the South Texas Heritage Center and past Black Cowboys. There's a restroom on your right. As you keep going, you'll go through the Dinosaur Gallery. Please take a look. Keep going through Texas Wild. You will turn right at George Strait, and then you will pass, or the Spiders exhibition, whichever you see first. You will pass another restroom on your left, and then you will be in the area where we will have most of our concurrent sessions throughout the day. On the left is the Dawson Family Hall. On the right is the Memorial Auditorium. There's a sign out front of each one that will tell you what sessions will be in those rooms. We've got a QR code for the program or your physical programs to help direct you in those areas. There is water, coffee, and tea right over there for you. And please feel free to move through the concurrent sessions to hear a little bit of both. But I'll remind you that the concurrent sessions will also be on YouTube for you to check out later. As you are here today, we have tried to be intentional to give you some rest time to think through and to shake off some of the tough subjects that you will be hearing today. Our lunch panel is 2 hours long to enable that break. As you are taking breaks, please feel free to explore and discover at your own pace the Whitty Museum. Our Black Cowboys exhibition is back in town and will be here through the first of the year. So please do explore at your leisure today and tomorrow. With that, we will start the concurrent sessions at 10:30. So you will make your way over to the other side, and we'll see you back in this room for lunch. Thank you.